I was married for a wager, bought like a bolt of cheap cloth from the back room of a textile shop. And yet, when I finally understood what Lord Sebastian Ashworth truly wanted from me, I realized that the cruelest bet of all was the one he had made with himself. The morning I became a baroness, the sky over London hung low and grey, as if the heavens themselves disapproved of the arrangement. I stood before a mirror in the small room I shared with my mother above the seamstress shop on Whitechapel Road, adjusting a dress I had sewn myself from scraps of ivory muslin, and I thought, this is not how brides are supposed to feel. There was no joy in my chest, no flutter of anticipation. Only a cold, practical resolve, the same resolve that had carried me through 16 years of stitching hems for women who never looked me in the eye, of measuring waists that grew ever slimmer while mine remained stubbornly round, of smiling politely when ladies whispered about the fat seamstress with the clever fingers and the unfortunate figure. My mother coughed from the bed behind me, a wet, rattling sound that had become the rhythm of our days. She was dying. I did not need a doctor to tell me this, though we had scraped together enough coins for one visit, and his grim expression had confirmed what I already knew. Consumption, he had said, as if giving the monster a name would somehow make it easier to fight. She had perhaps 3 months, perhaps less. The medicine that might ease her suffering cost more than I earned in a year. I turned from the mirror and crossed to her bedside, taking her thin hand in mine. Her skin was papery, almost translucent, and I could see the blue veins threading beneath like rivers on an ancient map. Once, these hands had been strong and clever, guiding mine through my first clumsy stitches, teaching me to cut fabric with precision and thread a needle by candlelight. Now they trembled with every breath she took. "You look beautiful," she whispered, and I knew she meant it, though we both understood it was not true. I was presentable. I was clean and properly dressed, and my hair had been arranged as neatly as my limited skills allowed. But beautiful was a word for other women. Women with slender waists and delicate features and skin that had never been roughened by years of labor. "I look like a seamstress in a borrowed dress," I said, but I smiled to take the sting from my words. "You look like my daughter." Her fingers tightened around mine with surprising strength. And that is enough for me. I bent to kiss her forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender water that she had worn for as long as I could remember, now underlaid with the sharper smell of illness. "When I return tonight," I said, "you will have your medicine. And a proper doctor, not that butcher from Aldgate. Everything is going to be different now." She did not argue with me, though I saw the doubt in her eyes. She had lived too long in Whitechapel to believe in fairy tales, even ones that arrived in the form of wealthy lords offering impossible bargains. But she was also too tired to fight, and so she merely nodded and closed her eyes, her breathing evening out into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep. I straightened and looked around the room that had been my entire world for so many years. The narrow bed we shared, the washstand with its chipped basin, the tiny window that looked out on the alley where rats fought over scraps and drunkards relieved themselves against the wall. The work table in the corner, covered with half-finished garments and spools of thread, the tools of a trade that had kept us alive but never allowed us to truly live. In a few hours, I would be the wife of one of the wealthiest men in London. In a few hours, I would walk away from all of this and into a life I could not even imagine. The thought should have brought me joy, or at least relief. Instead, I felt only a hollow dread, as if I were stepping off a cliff into darkness with no idea what lay below. Lord Ashworth had come to the shop 3 weeks prior, and the memory of that first meeting was seared into my mind with the clarity of a brand. I had heard of him, of course. Everyone in London had heard of the Aether-Baron, the eccentric aristocrat who had inherited his title young and spent his fortune on strange experiments in his laboratory. The society pages called him brilliant but cold, handsome but untouchable. They whispered that he had once been engaged to a beautiful woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. and that he had never been the same since. They said his eyes held the color of winter storms, and that his smile, on the rare occasions it appeared, never quite reached them. I had sewn a gown for his cousin once, a frothy confection of pink silk that had taken me weeks to complete and earned me barely enough to cover a month's rent. The young woman, Lady Cecily something or other, had tried on the finished dress in our shop and pronounced it adequate, a word that had stung more than any outright criticism. As I pinned the final alterations, she had chattered to her companion about a scandal at a recent ball where the Aether-Baron had made a shocking announcement. He bet them all, she had said, her voice bright with gossip's gleeful cruelty. £10,000 that he could take any woman at all, even the most unsuitable creature in London, and transform her into an acceptable lady within 6 months. Can you imagine? The poor wretch he chooses will be the laughingstock of society. Her companion had murmured something I could not hear, and they had both laughed, the sound like breaking crystal. I had kept my head down and continued my work, invisible as always, just the fat seamstress with the clever fingers who did not exist except as a function of her labor. I never imagined that I would become the object of that bet. He came to the shop on a Tuesday, just as the afternoon light was fading and I was lighting the lamps. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up from the work table where I was pinning a bodice, expecting another customer with a torn hem or a gown that needed letting out. Instead, I saw him. He was tall, taller than I had expected, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist beneath a coat of deepest black. His hair was dark as well, nearly black in the dim light, swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth set in a line that suggested he had forgotten how to smile. And those eyes, dear God, those eyes. They were the gray of storm clouds gathering over the Thames, and they fixed upon me with an intensity that made me feel as if he could see straight through my skin to the frightened heart beneath. The shop suddenly felt very small, the air thick and close. I was aware of every imperfection in my appearance, the ink stains on my fingers, the threads clinging to my skirt, the hair escaping from its pins to curl damply at my temples. I was aware, too, of the way his gaze traveled over me, clinical and assessing, cataloging my faults with the precision of a scientist examining a specimen. "Can I help you, sir?" I said, and I was proud that my voice did not tremble. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped further into the shop, his movements graceful despite his height, and looked around at the bolts of fabric stacked against the walls, the half-dressed dummies wearing unfinished gowns, the tools of my trade scattered across every available surface. He picked up a spool of crimson thread and turned it over in his long fingers, his expression thoughtful. "You are Evangeline Thorne," he said at last. It was not a question. "I am. You live with your mother above this shop. She is ill. Consumption. The medicine she requires costs more than you can afford." He set down the thread and turned those storm-gray eyes back to me. "You have been seeking additional work, taking on commissions that are below your skill level, simply to earn a few extra shillings. You have also been selling pieces of your mother's jewelry, the only valuables you possess, to pay for her treatment. At your current rate of expenditure, you will be bankrupt within 2 months. My hands tightened on the fabric I still held, my knuckles going white. "How do you know all of that?" "I make it my business to know things, Miss Thorne." He stepped closer, and I caught a scent that was strange and intriguing, something like ozone and machine oil mixed with sandalwood. "I also know that you are considered one of the finest seamstresses in Whitechapel, perhaps in all of London, that you have turned down 2 proposals of marriage because the men in question drank too much and would have spent your earnings at the public house, that you have not left this neighborhood in over a decade because you cannot afford to lose even a single day's work, and that, despite all of this, you have somehow maintained a dignity and intelligence that your circumstances should have long since crushed out of you." I felt exposed, flayed open by his knowledge. It was as if he had reached into my chest and laid my heart bare, examining its every scar and weakness with those cold, seeing eyes. No one had ever looked at me so closely before. No one had ever bothered. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. He told me. The words came out flat and emotionless, as if he were discussing a business transaction rather than a proposal of marriage. He explained the bet, the terms, the timeline. 6 months. If he could present me as a lady at the Winterbourne ball, if the cream of society accepted me as his wife without suspecting my origins, he would win. If he failed, he would lose a substantial portion of his fortune to the men who had wagered against him. Either way, I would be Lady Ashworth, wife to a baron, mistress of a great estate. Either way, my mother would have her medicine, her doctors, every comfort money could provide. "And if I refuse?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then you refuse." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost too human for his austere face. "I will find another candidate. There are other desperate women in London, other situations that can be exploited. But I should warn you, Miss Thorne, that I chose you specifically, not at random. Not because you were the most unsuitable woman I could find, though that is the story I have told the others. I chose you because my sources tell me you are intelligent, observant, and possessed of a quiet dignity that no amount of money can buy. These are qualities I require in a wife. Require. The word struck me like a slap. Not desire, not hope for. Require. As if I were a component in one of his machines, a part that needed to meet certain specifications. "Why do you require these qualities?" I asked. "If this is merely about winning a bet, any woman would do." His expression flickered, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something behind those storm-gray eyes, something haunted and desperate. But it was gone before I could name it. "Because I need a wife who can manage my household without constant supervision," he said, his voice brisk and businesslike once more. "A wife who can navigate society without embarrassing me. A wife who can think for herself and act independently when circumstances require it. My work demands most of my attention. I have neither the time nor the inclination for the usual courtship rituals or the endless social performances of matrimony. This arrangement suits my purposes. It can suit yours as well. I should have refused. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to refuse, to show this cold, arrogant lord the door and return to my quiet life of needles and thread and slowly watching my mother die. What kind of marriage was this? What kind of man proposed such a thing? I would be a trophy, a proof of his power, a puppet dancing on strings made of gold. But I looked at the closed door behind me, the door that led to the staircase that led to the room where my mother lay coughing her life away, and I knew that I had no choice at all. Pride was a luxury I could not afford. Dignity meant nothing if I had to watch the woman who had given me life suffocate in her own blood because I was too stubborn to accept help. "I accept," I said. He did not smile. He merely nodded, as if my capitulation was a foregone conclusion, and told me that a carriage would come for me in 3 days. He did not ask about my preferences, my concerns, my feelings about the arrangement. He did not offer words of comfort or reassurance. He simply turned and walked out of the shop, leaving me standing alone among my fabrics and threads, the ring he had placed on the counter glinting in the lamplight like a promise or a threat. The wedding was a small, efficient affair, conducted in a registry office with 2 of his servants as witnesses. I wore the ivory dress I had sewn myself, the best garment I owned, which suddenly looked shabby and provincial compared to the elegant attire of the witnesses and the cold perfection of Sebastian's black coat and silver waistcoat. The registrar spoke the words that would bind us together, and Sebastian repeated them in a voice that held no emotion at all, as if he were reciting a scientific formula. When he placed the ring on my finger, his hands were cold. I wondered if he felt anything at all, if there was any part of him that recognized the gravity of what we were doing, the lives we were binding together. But his face remained impassive, a mask of aristocratic indifference, and I told myself it did not matter. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. I had no right to expect tenderness or warmth from a man who had purchased me like livestock. After the ceremony, we rode in silence through the winding streets of London, past the familiar squalor of Whitechapel, and into neighborhoods I had only ever glimpsed from a distance. The houses grew larger, the streets cleaner, the people walking along the pavements dressed in fabrics I recognized from my work table. Servants hurried about their errands, children in starched pinafores played under the watchful eyes of nursemaids, ladies in fashionable bonnets strolled arm in arm with gentlemen in tall hats. It was a different world, separated from my own by mere miles, but as distant as the moon. The carriage turned down ever wider avenues, past parks and squares where iron railings enclosed gardens of perfect green. Eventually, we left the city altogether, passing through gates and along roads lined with ancient oaks, their bare branches interlacing overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. And then, just as the afternoon light was fading to the amber of approaching dusk, we turned through a tall iron gate and up a long drive lined with skeletal trees, their bare branches reaching toward the gray sky like supplicating hands. Ashworth Manor loomed before us, a massive structure of dark stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was beautiful in a severe, forbidding way, with tall windows that glinted like watchful eyes and towers that stretched toward the heavens. But there was something else about it, something I could not quite name. A heaviness in the air, a feeling of oppression that settled over me like a shroud. The house seemed to be waiting, watching, holding its breath. "This is your home now," Sebastian said, and I realized it was the first time I had thought of him by his given name. I stared up at the manor as the carriage slowed, trying to imagine myself walking through those imposing doors, sleeping in one of those many rooms, becoming the mistress of all of this. It seemed impossible, laughable, a fever dream from which I would surely wake to find myself back in Whitechapel with a needle in my hand and my mother coughing in the next room. But I did not wake. The carriage stopped, a footman opened the door, and Sebastian offered me his hand to help me down. His grip was firm and cool, completely impersonal, and he released me the moment my feet touched the gravel. The servants lined up to greet me in the entrance hall, a grand space of marble floors and dark wood paneling that soared 3 stories to a painted ceiling depicting scenes from classical mythology. They were fewer than I had expected for a house this size, perhaps 20 in all, and they watched me with expressions that ranged from curious to pitying. I saw the way their eyes traveled over my homemade dress, my rough hands, the provincial style of my hair. I saw the calculations behind their polite smiles, the assessments of just how far their new mistress had fallen short of what a baroness should be. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Blackwood, whose iron gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, curtsied stiffly and informed me that my rooms had been prepared in the east wing. My husband would occupy the west wing. We would share meals in the dining room when his lordship was available, but otherwise I was free to explore the house and grounds as I wished. With one exception, Sebastian added, and his voice carried a note of warning that made the servants shift uneasily. The laboratory in the basement is strictly forbidden. You are never to enter it under any circumstances. Is that understood? I nodded, though curiosity flickered in my chest like a small flame. I understood. He left me then, disappearing down a corridor without a backward glance, and I was led to my rooms by a young maid named Alice, who could not have been more than 16. She chattered nervously as we walked, pointing out the library here, the music room there, the gallery where portraits of long-dead Ashworths stared down with disapproving eyes. She told me about the house's history, built in the time of Charles II, expanded by every generation of Ashworths since. She mentioned the ghost that was said to walk the west wing, a lady in white who had died of a broken heart 2 centuries past. She gossiped about the servants, who was walking out with whom, which of the footmen was the most handsome, which of the maids was closest to being dismissed for laziness. I listened with half an ear, too overwhelmed to truly absorb her words. The house seemed endless. Corridor after corridor of dark wood and rich carpets and paintings in gilded frames. There were rooms for purposes I could not even imagine, a morning room, an afternoon room, a room for taking tea, a room for receiving guests, a room for playing cards, a room for listening to music. There were more fireplaces than I could count, more chandeliers than I had ever seen outside of a church, more space than I knew what to do with. My rooms, when we finally reached them, were more luxurious than anything I had ever seen. A sitting room with velvet armchairs and a writing desk by the window, a dressing room lined with wardrobes and mirrors, and the bedchamber itself, dominated by a canopied bed draped in deep blue velvet, a fireplace crackling with welcoming warmth, and windows that looked out over a garden that must have been beautiful in summer, but now lay dormant beneath a thin layer of frost. "Is there anything you need, my lady?" Alice asked, and the title sounded foreign on her tongue, as if she too could not quite believe that the fat seamstress from Whitechapel was now a baroness. "No," I said. "Thank you." She left, and I stood alone in the center of my new life, feeling more isolated than I had ever felt before. The first weeks at Ashworth Manor passed in a blur of lessons and loneliness. Sebastian had hired a series of tutors to transform me into a lady, experts in deportment and elocution, dancing and dining etiquette, history and conversation. They arrived each morning like a small army, armed with books and diagrams and an inexhaustible supply of criticism. "Your posture is abysmal," the deportment mistress, a skeletal woman named Mrs. Crane, informed me on my very first day. She placed a book on my head and told me to walk across the room without letting it fall. I took 3 steps before it tumbled to the floor. "We will be here for quite some time," she sighed. The elocution tutor, a young man named Mr. Phillips, who seemed perpetually surprised by his own existence, made me repeat phrases over and over until my tongue felt thick and clumsy. "Round the rough and rugged rock, the ragged rascal ran," he would say, and I would echo him, trying to smooth the edges of my Whitechapel accent into something acceptable. The difference between how I spoke and how a lady was supposed to speak seemed vast as an ocean, impossible to cross. The dancing master, a wiry Italian named Signor Benedetti, was the worst of all. He would seize my hands and whirl me around the ballroom while an ancient pianist pounded out waltzes on the pianoforte, correcting my every step with sharp commands. No, no, no. The feet. They must glide, not stomp. You are a lady, not a cart horse. Again, from the beginning. By the end of each day, I was exhausted in body and spirit. My feet ached from dancing, my head ached from memorizing, and my pride ached from the constant reminder that everything I was, everything I had been, was wrong. I would retire to my rooms and stand before the mirror, looking at the woman reflected there, and wonder who she was becoming. The ivory dress I had worn to my wedding hung in the wardrobe now, a relic of my former life, replaced by gowns that Sebastian had ordered made for me in London. They were beautiful, of course, silk and satin in jewel tones that I would never have dared to wear in Whitechapel. But they felt like costumes. Disguises for a role I did not know how to play. I discovered, a quick study, despite my tutor's complaints. The same attention to detail that made me an excellent seamstress served me well in this new endeavor. I memorized the complicated rules of precedence that determined who entered a room first and who sat where at dinner. I learned the proper forms of address for every rank of nobility, from dukes down to the younger sons of earls. I practiced curtsying until I could sink to the floor and rise again in one smooth motion, without wobbling or clutching at furniture for support. I learned which fork to use for which course, how to hold a teacup, how to fan myself in a way that was elegant rather than desperate. But no matter how much I learned, I could not shake the feeling that I was an imposter, a fraud dressed in borrowed finery. The other servants treated me with distant respect, but I caught them whispering when they thought I could not hear. The fat seamstress, they called me. the Whitechapel bride, his lordship's little experiment. I pretended not to notice, kept my chin high and my expression neutral, but the words lodged in my heart like splinters. I tried not to let it wound me. I had endured worse. Sebastian, for his part, was a ghost in his own house. I saw him at meals when he deigned to appear, sitting at the far end of a table long enough to seat 20, making polite but distant conversation, while course after course was served by silent footmen. He asked about my lessons, nodded at my progress, offered the occasional suggestion for improvement. But there was no warmth in his manner, no hint that he saw me as anything more than a project to be completed, a problem to be solved. I tried at first to draw him out. I asked about his work, his interests, his childhood in this great house. But he deflected every question with practiced ease, turning the conversation back to me, to my training, to the 100 small ways I still fell short of his expectations. After a few weeks, I stopped trying. If he wanted distance between us, then distance he would have. At night, I sometimes heard sounds from the basement, the laboratory he had forbidden me to enter. Strange humming noises, like great engines turning. Mechanical clicks and whirs that seemed to pulse with a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. And once, a flash of light so bright it leaked through the cracks around the locked door and illuminated the hallway like lightning during a storm. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered what he was doing down there in the dark. I asked Mrs. Blackwood about it one morning when I encountered her in the corridor near the kitchen. "The laboratory," I said, keeping my voice casual. "What exactly does Lord Ashworth do down there?" Her face, which was never exactly warm, turned to stone. "His lordship's work is not to be discussed, my lady, but surely you must know something. The sounds alone, the lights. There must be servants who assist him. His lordship works alone." She pressed her lips together so tightly they nearly disappeared. "He has done so ever since. Well, ever since." She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before saying too much. "You should return to your lessons, my lady. The dancing master is waiting." She swept away before I could ask more, leaving me standing in the corridor with more questions than I had started with. Ever since what? What had happened that made Sebastian lock himself away in that basement, night after night? And why was everyone so terrified of speaking about it? I should have let it go. I had my mother's medicine to think of. Her health improving now that she had proper care at a private hospital Sebastian had arranged. I had lessons to focus on, a transformation to complete. The Winterbourne ball was only 4 months away, and I was far from ready. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, and mine had always been stronger than was prudent. So I began to watch, and to listen, and slowly, piece by piece, the truth began to reveal itself. It began with the servants, or rather, with their absence. In my first month at the manor, 3 servants left without notice: a footman named Thomas, a kitchen maid named Bridget, and a gardener whose name I never learned. Mrs. Blackwood told me they had found positions elsewhere, better opportunities that had come up suddenly and could not be refused. But something in her eyes suggested a different truth, a fear that she was trying very hard to hide. I went to the servants' hall one afternoon when I knew most of the staff would be busy with their duties, and found Alice polishing silver in the pantry. She jumped when she saw me, nearly dropping the spoon she was working on. "My lady," she gasped. "I did not expect, that is. Can I help you with something?" "Thomas," I said, "the footman who left last week. Did he say where he was going?" Alice's face went pale. I do not know, my lady. He did not say." "You were walking out with him, were you not?" I kept my voice gentle, trying to put her at ease. "I heard you mention it when I first arrived. Surely he would have told you if he was planning to leave." She twisted the cloth in her hands, her eyes darting toward the door, as if afraid someone might overhear. "He did not plan to leave, my lady. He was working late one night, helping his lordship with something in the laboratory, and the next morning, he was gone. Gone where? I do not know. She was trembling now, tears gathering in her eyes. Mrs. Blackwood said he took a position in the country, but he left all his things behind, his clothes, his books, the little wooden box where he kept my letters. He would not have left those, my lady. He treasured them. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty pantry. What happened to him, Alice? What really happened? She shook her head, backing away from me. I cannot say, my lady. I do not know. Please, you must not ask me such questions. If Mrs. Blackwood finds out I spoke to you about this, she will dismiss me without a reference. Please, my lady. I let her go, but her words stayed with me. Thomas, the footman, Bridget, the kitchen maid, the gardener whose name no one seemed to remember. All gone, all left suddenly, all connected somehow to Sebastian's work in the basement. I started paying attention after that. I noticed the way the remaining servants avoided certain corridors after dark, scurrying through the house with their heads down and their eyes averted. I noticed the way they crossed themselves when they passed the door to the basement, a quick, furtive gesture that they probably thought I did not see. I noticed the fear that lurked behind their polite smiles, the tension that ran through the household like a wire about to snap. And I noticed Sebastian. The dark circles under his eyes grew deeper with each passing week, as if sleep had become a stranger to him. He forgot to eat, pushing food around his plate without ever raising the fork to his lips. His hands trembled when he thought no one was watching, a fine tremor that he tried to hide by clasping them behind his back or shoving them into his pockets. He grew thinner, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, and there was a fevered brightness in his gray eyes that frightened me. Whatever he was doing in that laboratory, it was consuming him. I also noticed the portrait. It hung in the gallery alongside the other Ashworth ancestors, but it was different from the rest. Newer, for one thing, the colors still vivid where the older paintings had faded to muted tones. And the subject was not some long dead lord in his finery, but a young woman, beautiful and golden and radiantly alive. She had hair the color of sunlight, cascading in artful waves over bare shoulders. Her dress was the delicate pink of cherry blossoms, the fabric painted with such skill that it seemed to float around her like a cloud. But it was her eyes that drew me, held me, made me stand before the portrait for long minutes at a time. They were blue, a deep and vibrant blue like the heart of a flame, and they seemed to look out of the canvas with an expression of such warmth and mischief that I half expected her to laugh. There was a small brass plaque at the bottom of the frame. Lady Arabella Ashworth, it read, 1858 to 1883. She had been 25 years old when she died, my age. I found Sebastian standing before the portrait one evening, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. He did not hear my approach, so absorbed was he in contemplating that smiling face, and when I spoke his name, he flinched as if I had struck him. "Who is she?" I asked. "The woman in the painting." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words he could not quite bring himself to speak. Then finally, in a voice so low I had to strain to hear it, he said, "Her name was Arabella. She was my fiancée. She died 4 years ago. I am sorry. Are you?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment the mask slipped. I saw grief there, raw and terrible, a wound that had never healed. But I also saw something else, something that looked almost like guilt. She died because of me, Lady Ashworth, because of my arrogance, my obsession with pushing the boundaries of what is possible. I thought I could save her. Instead, I destroyed her. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and terrible. I did not know what to say, did not know what comfort I could possibly offer this broken man who had bought me like a piece of furniture and now stood before me with his soul laid bare. "What happened to her?" I asked at last. He set down his teacup and rose, his movements stiff and controlled, every inch the aristocrat once more. "I have said too much. Good evening." He was gone before I could respond, and I was left alone with the portrait and my questions and the growing certainty that I had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple wager. The pieces began to fall into place, slowly, like a pattern emerging from chaos. I searched the library when I knew Sebastian was occupied in his laboratory, running my fingers along the spines of ancient books until I found the ones that interested me most. The library was vast, room after room of shelves, stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes on every subject imaginable. But it was the section devoted to science that drew me, the books with their leather bindings and gold-lettered spines that spoke of experiments and discoveries and the endless human quest to understand the universe. I found treatises on electricity and magnetism, thick volumes filled with diagrams and equations that made my head spin. I found journals from the Royal Society, records of experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. I found books on medicine and anatomy, on chemistry and physics, on all the sciences that were transforming the world around us. And I found books on stranger things, spiritualism, mesmerism, the occult, books about the boundary between life and death, about communication with the departed, about the possibility of reaching beyond the veil that separated the living from the dead. Books about something called ether, a substance that some scientists believed permeated all of space, connecting everything in the universe like an invisible web. The ether theory was familiar to me, at least in its broad outlines. Even in Whitechapel, we heard talk of the great scientific debates of the age, the questions about what light was and how it traveled, about whether empty space was truly empty or filled with some invisible medium. But these books went further. They spoke of the ether not merely as a carrier of light, but as a bridge between worlds, as a force that connected the living to the dead, the material to the spiritual, the seen to the unseen. And in the margins of these books, in handwriting I had come to recognize, were notes. Sebastian had written on every page, cramped annotations that covered every available inch of white space. He had underlined passages, circled diagrams, scrawled questions and hypotheses in ink that ranged from fresh black to faded brown. He had been studying these books for years, I realized. He had been searching for something he believed he could find in the spaces between the words. I found his personal journals as well, hidden in a locked drawer in the desk at the back of the library. The lock was a simple one, easily opened with a hairpin, a skill I had learned in Whitechapel, where locks were often all that stood between survival and starvation. Inside the drawer were a dozen leather-bound notebooks, each one filled with Sebastian's handwriting, and I settled into a chair by the window to read them. The early entries were dated from before Arabella's death, and they were filled with hope and excitement. Sebastian wrote about his experiments with etheric energy, about the apparatus he was building in the basement, about his conviction that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change everything humanity knew about the nature of existence. "If I can harness the ether," he wrote in one entry, "I can prove that consciousness survives the death of the body. I can demonstrate that there is no true death, only a transition from one state of being to another. This will not merely be a scientific discovery. It will be a revolution in human understanding. It will free us from the fear of death forever." Arabella appeared in the entries frequently, her name surrounded by words of love and admiration. He wrote about her laughter, her curiosity, her eagerness to understand his work. "She believes in me," he wrote. "When everyone else thinks me mad, she believes. She is the light that guides me through the darkness of uncertainty." And then the entries changed. March 15, 1883. The experiment failed. I overloaded the apparatus. I tried to pull her free, but the etheric discharge was too powerful. She is gone. God help me, she is gone. The entries that followed were fragmentary, the writing barely legible in places, as if his hand had been shaking too violently to hold the pen steady. He wrote of guilt and grief, of nightmares and sleepless nights, of a despair so profound that I feared to read further. He wrote of the funeral, which he had attended alone, of the pitying looks from the other mourners, of the whispers that followed him wherever he went. The Aether-Baron, they called him, the man who killed his fiancée with his mad experiments. But even in the depths of his despair, he never stopped believing. He never stopped working. He simply changed his goal. "If I can harness enough etheric energy," he wrote in an entry dated 6 months after Arabella's death, "I can reach her. I can bring her back. The apparatus that killed her can also resurrect her. I am certain of it now. The principles are sound. I simply need more power, more control, and a conduit strong enough to channel the energy without being destroyed. A conduit." The word sent a chill down my spine. I read faster, my eyes scanning the pages with growing horror. Sebastian wrote of his search for the perfect conduit, the person whose life force was strong enough to power the connection between worlds. He wrote of experiments with servants, of testing their vitality using devices of his own invention, of the ones who grew weak and had to be sent away before they faded completely. He wrote of his frustration, his desperation, his growing certainty that he would never find what he needed. And then, in an entry dated just 2 months before he had come to my shop, I found my own name. Evangeline Thorne, seamstress, Whitechapel, age 25. My sources report that she has survived illness, poverty, and hardship that would have killed a lesser person. Her vitality is remarkable, almost supernatural. If my instruments are correct, she possesses a life force strong enough to power the apparatus at its fullest capacity. She may be the one I have been searching for. My blood ran cold. I understood then what he was doing in that basement laboratory. He was not merely conducting experiments. He was not searching for scientific truth. He was trying to resurrect his dead fiancée, and he had married me because he needed my life force to do it. I sat for a long time after I finished reading, staring out the window at the winter garden below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of fire, of the flash of light I had seen leaking from beneath the basement door. I thought about the servants who had disappeared, their vitality drained to fuel Sebastian's obsession. I thought about my own growing weakness, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure, the strange hollow feeling that came over me at odd moments as if something were being slowly siphoned out of me. I should confront him, I thought. I should demand explanations, threaten to leave, go to the authorities. He had deceived me. He had married me under false pretenses. He was using me, draining me, and if I did not act, I would end up like the others, faded and weak, and sent away to die in some obscure corner of the countryside. But I did not confront him. Not yet. Because even as my mind recoiled from what I had learned, my heart whispered a different message. I thought of the grief I had seen in his eyes when he spoke of Arabella. I thought of the desperation that drove him to lock himself in that basement night after night, pursuing an impossible dream. I thought of the man behind the monster, the broken, brilliant, terrible man who had loved someone so much that he was willing to sacrifice everything, even his own soul, to bring her back. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that there might still be something worth saving. So I did not confront him. Instead, I watched and waited and gathered more information. I needed to understand exactly what he was doing, how far he had progressed, what would happen if he succeeded. I needed to know the full truth before I could decide what to do with it. The truth, when it finally came, was worse than anything I had imagined. I began to notice changes in myself as well, subtle at first, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. A strange weakness in my limbs that came and went without warning. Moments when I felt as if something were draining out of me, leaving me hollow and shaking. My appetite decreased, my color faded, and dark circles appeared beneath my eyes that no amount of rest could erase. I mentioned it to Mrs. Blackwood one morning, when I caught her watching me with an expression that might have been pity. "You look tired, my lady," she said. "Perhaps you should rest more. The lessons can wait." The lessons cannot wait, I reminded her. The Winterborn ball is in 3 months. I still have so much to learn. She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in her eyes. There are more important things than balls, my lady. Some lessons are not worth learning. Before I could ask what she meant, she excused herself and hurried away, leaving me standing in the corridor with yet another piece of the puzzle that I could not quite fit into place. And yet, at the same time as I was fading, something else was happening. Something that confused me, that complicated the neat narrative of villain and victim I had constructed in my mind. Sebastian was watching me. Not in the clinical, assessing way he had watched me in the shop, cataloging my faults and calculating my usefulness. This was different. I would look up from my embroidery to find his eyes on me, his expression unreadable but intent. At meals, he asked questions that went beyond my lessons, questions about my childhood, my mother, my dreams for the future. He remembered things I had mentioned in passing, a fondness for roses that my mother had grown in a window box, a fear of thunderstorms that had plagued me since childhood, the way I hummed while I sewed without realizing I was doing it. Once, he came upon me in the garden, standing among the dormant rose bushes with my face turned up to catch the weak winter sun. I had been crying, though I did not want him to know that. The loneliness of this great house had overwhelmed me, and I had slipped outside to hide my weakness from the servants. I did not hear his approach until he was beside me, and when I startled, he reached out to steady me, his hand warm and strong on my elbow. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to frighten you. You did not frighten me." I looked up at him, at the sharp planes of his face, and the shadows beneath his eyes, and I felt something shift in my chest. Something dangerous. "You look tired, my lord." "Sebastian." His voice was soft. "When we are alone, please call me Sebastian." "Sebastian," I repeated, and the name felt intimate on my tongue, as if speaking it made something real between us that had not been real before. He did not release my elbow. He stood there, looking down at me with that unreadable expression, and I realized that his eyes were not simply gray. They held flecks of blue at their centers, like frozen sky, and they were filled with a longing so profound that it made my breath catch. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I am exactly what you wagered on. A fat seamstress from Whitechapel. No." His hand moved from my elbow to my chin, tilting my face up toward his. He did not flinch from my words, did not try to correct or soften them. "You are intelligent and observant and stronger than anyone I have ever met. You see things that others miss. You survive things that would break a lesser person. And your body," he added, his gaze dropping briefly to the curves I had spent my life trying to hide before returning to my eyes, "is not a flaw to be corrected. It is simply part of who you are, a part that speaks of resilience, of life, of a vitality that shines from you like light from a flame, as is my coldness part of me. We are both, in our ways, unsuitable for the roles society would have us play." I did not know what to say. No one had ever spoken to me like that, had ever looked at me as if my roundness, my softness, the weight I had carried my entire life like a burden, were anything other than a mark of my failure to be what a woman should be. No one had ever suggested that my body might be a source of strength rather than shame. "Why did you really choose me?" I whispered. He released me and stepped back, and the shutters came down behind his eyes once more. "I chose you because I needed a wife," he said. "That is all." But it was not all. I knew it, and I suspected he knew that I knew. There was something growing between us, something neither of us had expected or wanted. I saw it in the way he looked at me, in the softening of his voice when we spoke, in the small kindnesses he offered, a book left on my pillow that he thought I might enjoy, a fire lit in my room before I retired, fresh roses from the greenhouse placed in a vase by my window. He was falling for me, Against his will, against his plans, against everything he believed he wanted, Sebastian Ashworth was falling for the unsuitable wife he had purchased to power his impossible machine. And God help me, I was falling for him too. Whatever truths lay between us would have to wait, because that night, everything changed. I woke in darkness to the sound of screaming. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, caught in one of the nightmares that had plagued me since childhood, visions of fire and falling and faceless figures chasing me through endless corridors. But the screaming did not stop, and when I threw back the covers and stumbled to my door, I realized it was coming from below, from the basement. The hallway was empty, the servants either still asleep or too frightened to emerge. I grabbed a candle from the table by my door and made my way down the stairs, my nightgown billowing around my ankles, my bare feet cold against the marble floors. The screaming grew louder as I approached the basement door, a sound that was not quite human, that seemed to come from somewhere between worlds. And beneath it, I could see that strange, pulsing light, brighter than before, bright enough to burn. I should have gone back. I should have called for help, for the servants, for anyone. But something compelled me forward, some force I could not name and could not resist. My hand reached out and grasped the handle of the basement door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I did not stop to think. I threw open the door and descended into hell. The laboratory was vast, far larger than I had imagined, a cathedral of machinery and glass that stretched the entire length of the basement. The ceiling arched overhead like the nave of a church, supported by columns of dark metal that hummed with barely contained energy. Cables snaked across the floor like metallic serpents, connecting towering coils that crackled with blue electricity. There were workbenches covered with instruments I did not recognize, glass tubes filled with glowing liquids, machines that whirred and clicked and pulsed with their own strange life. And at the center of it all stood a massive apparatus, unlike anything I had ever seen or dreamed of seeing. It was a chamber of metal and crystal, perhaps 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide, covered in pipes and wires and dials that measured forces I could not begin to understand. The crystal at its heart was the source of the light, a brilliant blue radiance that pulsed like a heartbeat, that made my eyes water and my skin tingle with something that was not quite warmth. And inside the chamber, visible through the crystal like a figure seen through water, was a shape that might once have been human, but now seemed made entirely of that terrible light. Sebastian stood before the apparatus, his back to me, his arms raised as if in supplication. He was wearing his shirt sleeves, his coat and waistcoat discarded, and I could see the tension in every line of his body, the desperation in the set of his shoulders. The light from the chamber illuminated him in flashes, and I could see that he was bleeding, a gash on his forehead streaming red down his pale face. But he did not seem to notice. His attention was fixed on the figure in the chamber, on the shape that was slowly, impossibly, beginning to solidify. "Arabella," he was crying, his voice raw with hope and anguish. "Arabella, please, come back to me. I have done everything you asked. I have built the bridge. I have found the conduit. Please, my love, come back." The figure turned, and I saw a face that might have been beautiful once, golden hair streaming around features that flickered between solid and translucent. But her eyes were wrong. They were empty, hollow, pits of darkness in that radiant face that held no spark of life, no trace of the warmth I had seen in the portrait. They were filled with something that was not life, but its terrible opposite. Something hungry, something wrong. And then those empty eyes found me. The effect was instantaneous. The figure, the thing that might have been Arabella, let out a shriek that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The apparatus began to shudder and spark, lightning arcing between the coils, the crystal at its heart pulsing faster and brighter. And I felt a pull, a terrible draining sensation that was 100 times worse than the weakness I had experienced before. I understood then, with horrible clarity, what was happening. The apparatus did not merely bring the dead back to life, it required life to function. It required a source, a conduit, a vessel full of vitality from which it could draw the energy to breach the barrier between worlds. And that vessel was me. Even from across the room, even without wires or connections or any physical contact, the thing in the chamber was draining me. I felt my strength flowing out of me like water from a broken vessel, pouring through the air and into that crystal, feeding that terrible hungry light. My knees buckled, my vision blurred. The candle slipped from my nerveless fingers and guttered out on the floor. Evangeline. Sebastian had finally turned, had finally seen me standing in the doorway. His face went white with shock and horror. "What are you doing here? You have to run, now." But I could not run. I could not move at all. The pull was too strong, the draining too intense. I felt myself falling. Felt the cold stone of the floor rushing up to meet me. Felt the last of my strength slipping away into the darkness. And through it all, I saw the thing in the chamber, saw Arabella, or what remained of her, and I saw that she was smiling. I am not certain what happened next. My memories of those moments are fractured, shattered by pain and terror, and the overwhelming sense of being pulled apart at the seams. I remember falling to my knees. I remember Sebastian's voice, screaming something I could not understand. I remember his arms around me, lifting me, carrying me away from the light. I remember the sound of glass shattering and metal screaming, and then finally, blessed silence. When I woke, I was in my bed, and Sebastian was sitting beside me with his head in his hands. The curtains were drawn, but thin lines of gray light leaked around the edges, telling me it was morning. My body felt heavy and strange, as if I had been ill for weeks rather than hours. But I was alive. I was still alive. He did not look up when I stirred, but he spoke, his voice raw and broken. "I should have told you," he said. "From the beginning, I should have told you what I was doing, what you were for." I was too weak to feel the anger that I knew would come later. I could only lie there, watching the firelight play across his bent shoulders and wait for him to continue. "Arabella died in my laboratory," he said, 4 years ago. We were engaged to be married, and she was curious about my work, and I, fool that I was, I showed her the apparatus. I was so proud of what I had built, so certain that I was on the verge of proving everything I believed. I wanted to share it with her. I wanted her to see. He drew a shuddering breath. It was supposed to be safe. I had tested it dozens of times, calibrated every parameter, accounted for every variable, but I had never tested it with a human subject. The theory suggested it would work, that a person could step into the etheric field and experience the connection between worlds without harm. But theory and reality are not always the same. "Sebastian," I whispered. She insisted on being the first. His voice cracked on the words. She said she wanted to feel what I felt when I touched the boundary between worlds. She said she trusted me. And I let her. I was so certain of my calculations, so confident in my own genius. I let the woman I loved step into an untested machine, and I activated it, and I killed her. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the house waking around us. "Something went wrong," he continued at last. "The apparatus overloaded. The etheric discharge built faster than I had predicted, and she was caught in the backlash. I tried to pull her free, but it was too late. She was—" He could not finish the sentence for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "She was gone, and I could not accept it. I could not accept that my arrogance, my hubris, had killed the only woman I had ever loved." He finally looked up, and I saw that he was weeping, tears tracking silently down his face like rain on marble. "So I built a new apparatus," he said, "stronger, more powerful, more precise. I believed that if I could harness enough etheric energy, If I could create a stable bridge between this world and the next, I could reach her. I could bring her back from wherever she had gone. I could undo what I had done. But the apparatus requires a source, I said. My voice was stronger than I had expected. It requires life force to power the connection. Yes. He nodded, unable to meet my eyes. The etheric bridge needs enormous energy to remain stable. I tried to power it with electricity, with chemical reactions, with every form of energy I could devise, but nothing worked. Nothing had the right quality, until I began to experiment with vitality itself, with life force. The servants who left, I said, Thomas, Bridget, the gardener, they were not strong enough. He spoke quickly, the words tumbling out as if he had held them back for too long. I never meant to harm them. I only drained a little at a time, just enough to test the apparatus, to calibrate the connection. But even that was too much for most people. They grew weak, tired, confused. I sent them away with enough money to start new lives, to recover from what I had done. But they were not strong enough to sustain the full activation. None of them were. And then you found me. Yes. His voice was barely audible. My sources told me of a woman in Whitechapel who had survived things that should have killed her. Illness, poverty, years of labor that would have broken anyone else. They said you had a vitality that was almost supernatural, a life force that burned brighter than anyone they had ever encountered. I thought, he swallowed hard, I thought that with your strength, with your remarkable resilience, I could finally complete the connection. I could finally bring Arabella home. I stared at him, at this brilliant, broken man who had married me for a wager that had never been about money at all. I should have been furious. I should have screamed at him for his cruelty, for his willingness to sacrifice me on the altar of his obsession. I should have gotten out of bed that instant, walked out of the house, and never looked back. But all I felt was a terrible, aching sadness.